James Lake, Jr. was born 1788 at White Creek, Albany County, New York, to James Lake, Sr. and Margaret Hagerman, a German descendant of New Jersey. When the American Revolution came into being, James Lake, Sr., like his father John Lake and his brothers, gave their support to the British cause, was dispossessed and burned out, and so lost to the colonies in New York, and they moved to Canada West at Ernestown Township, Lennox and Addington Counties, Canada, where he petitioned for and received land for him and his children for being loyalists to the United Empire of Britain. So James Jr. was raised in Canada. James Jr. was only 5 years old when he arrived in Ernestown. James Lake Jr. petitioned later and received 200 acres of land and later received more through inheritance. James Lake Jr. meets Mary Lake, born about 1790, and marries her about 1809, a cousin, daughter of John Lake Jr. and Miss Verhees at Ernestown, Upper Canada. They had 4 children: George, he died at age 11, Dennis, Cyrus, and Mary. Mary Lake died 11 April 1860 while giving birth at Ernestown, Upper Canada. James Jr. now had to raise 4 children under the age of 6, she having died giving birth. James Lake Jr.'s second wife was Elizabeth Stover. Elizabeth was born 29 September 1788 to Valentine Stover and Christine Emmy. They were married 15 August 1860 at Ernestown. Their children were Julia, Lawrence, and James III. While clearing land for the home and crops, James Lake Jr. accidentally struck his left shin with an axe, tearing the flesh and splintering the bone. With each beat of his heart, the blood would gush out from the wound. All his wife's efforts to stop the flow of blood seemed to be futile. It appeared that he could not survive when suddenly a handsome gray-halted gentleman came into the room and said, "How do you do, my good friend? You seem to be in trouble." James says, "Yes, it looks as though my moments are numbered in this life." James answered. The old gentleman took from his pocket a small bottle and handed it to James and told him, "Just apply this and the bleeding will stop." He then turned and walked out of the room. James called Elizabeth, saying, "Follow that man quickly and see where he goes." She hurried to the door but could not see the man anywhere. James' leg stopped bleeding with the first application of the medicine. This incident occurred sometime before James received the gospel of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But when he read about the 3 Nephites in the Book of Mormon, he was convinced that the white-haired gentleman who had saved his life was one of them. This was written by Ida Lake Turley. The family was desperately poor. Then when Elizabeth Stover dies in 1823, she leaves her husband not only crippled, desperately poor, but also with a family of 6 living children. James gives 2 of his children, Julia and James, to his sister Margaret Madsen to raise. She and her husband later adopted them. James, with his family, were living at this time at Camden, Upper Canada, on land granted him from the Crown's lands. There in 1825, Brigham Young helped him build a log cabin. They were friends, and over the years, Brigham Young visited him often. It was probably also through Brigham Young that he met Pamela Smith, a widow who had a family of 5 children. James Jr. and Pamela were married 3 September 1823. Pamela was born 13 April 1794 at Brookfield, Vermont, the daughter of Parker Smith and Sarah Lomas. Pamela had been early left an orphan. She had been reared and trained by her grandmother, Sarah Huntington Lomas. At age 18, she had married her first cousin, Ira Smith, and was widowed with these 5 children: Lyman, James Harvey, Elizabeth Boardman, Josiah William, and Esther. Not all of these children embraced the gospel of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Pamela Smith had these 5 children, while James Lake Jr. had 6 still living. When they were married, they were merged into one big family of 11 children. After their marriage, they had 10 more children: Sabra Lake, William Bailey Lake, Barnabas Lake, Clarissa Lake, Jane Lake, Lydia Ann Lake, Moroni Lake, Samantha Lake, George Lake, and Sarah Amanda Lake. When they were married, James Lake and Pamela Smith were living at Camden, Ontario, to the north of Ernstown. They were visited by Latter-day Saint elders Brigham, Joseph, and Phineas Young in 1832. They accepted the teachings of the Mormon Church and were baptized July 1832 by Elder Eliza Miller. From this place, a company of saints were led by Brigham Young on July 1, 1833, and with this family, James Lake Jr. and family went to Kirtland, Ohio. Pamela had left her 13-year-old daughter, Esther, who had been visiting relatives in another town. When it was time for the family to move to Ohio, she was heading home to join her family and move with them, but was delayed. As the date of sailing drew near, Pamela began to watch anxiously for the arrival of their daughter, Esther. A message had been sent for her to join the family, but the days passed and she did not come. The final departure was made. Pamela's heart ached with the yearning for her lovely brown-eyed daughter as she stood on the deck watching the shore. Esther's arrival had been delayed because of an accident on the road. Bitterly, Pamela wept as she stood on the pier and realized the separation from her family was becoming greater with each passing moment. She returned to her relatives, Esther did, and never did join the rest of the family. She stayed in Canada and married there. Pamela never saw her daughter again in this life. James Lake Jr. and his sons assisted as bricklayer and hauling stone for the building of the first LDS temple in Kirtland, Ohio. Lyman and Dennis later left as part of Zion's camp on May 5, 1834. Lyman was later ordained to the Quorum of 70, 28 February 1825. The cornerstone was set 23 July 1833, and the Temple of Kirtland was dedicated 27 March 1836. July 6, 1838, the saints left Kirtland, Ohio, called Kirtland Camp. When the saints were forced to leave Kirtland, James and his family went to Geneva, Kane County, Illinois. The two youngest children were born here. They rented land and farmed to obtain money with which to continue with the saints. Later they came to Augusta, Illinois, just 15 miles southeast of Carthage, and traveled to Nauvoo, Illinois, where again they helped to build a temple, the Nauvoo Temple, and to build it and beautify the city. When the Mormons were once again forced to flee with many others, they crossed the Mississippi on the ice in the winter, and so made their way to Council Bluffs, Iowa. Jane Lake was just 8 when they left Kirtland, and now at age 15, she was baptized on September 1845 in the Mississippi River by Loren Farr, who later became the first state president of Ogden. James and Pamela Lake were endowed December 31, 1845 in the Nauvoo Temple, and on February 1846 they were forced out of Nauvoo. Captain James Allen of the Army recruited 500 men at Council Bluffs for the Mormon Battalion on 16 July 1846. Barnabas Lake and Joseph Taylor mustered into Company A. President Green Taylor was too sick to go, so he stayed. A government that had so cruelly driven them from their homes and failed to protect them now was asking for volunteers to defend their country, and they willingly accepted. In the month of February 1846, we crossed the great Mississippi River, and with our heavily loaded wagons on the ice, a company of about 600 other wagons, being driven by a ruthless mob to seek a home beyond the reach of their violence. James Lake's family arrives in Council Bluffs, Iowa. Here James Lake Jr. was appointed as a bishop award to look after the wants of the widows and fatherless. It was here that he made what he called an Armstrong mill. He split a log in two, gorged out a hole in the center of it, then bound the two halves together, bore a hole into the excavation he made, and pouring in the corn with a pestle, pounded the corn into meal so it could be cooked. The boys would scurry about over the cornfields, so gathering nubbins and any ears that had been dropped or left on the stalks. They spent a terrible winter there. Not being prepared for the long journey across the plains in the spring of 1847, the family moved south into Holt County, Missouri, where they rented land and farmed. There was plenty of help, so they worked hard and prospered and so gathered crops with their stock. When in the spring of 1850 James Lake determined to take his family to Utah, they returned to Florence, Nebraska, across the river from Council Bluffs, where a large group was making ready for a journey across the plains. When the Mormon battalion did arrive in Fort Leavenworth, they sent $7,000 to President Brigham Young, and Bishop Newell K. Whitney went for much-needed supplies for the destitute saints in 1847. William Lake and Pleasant Green Taylor went to Missouri to find work to help their families until on May 1850 they all started west. James Lake Company of 54 wagons, they arrived in Fort Laramie. The stronger teams leave 34 wagons behind, and Pleasant Green Taylor refused to leave them, their sick people, and went slower. James Lake was appointed leader of 50. Early in 1850, this caravan started for Utah. When they neared the Platte River, cholera broke out in the camp. One of James' daughters was attacked by the disease, but was healed through faith and prompt attention. A daughter-in-law contracted the disease and died. James and family arrived in Salt Lake on October 7, 1850, after long months of grueling travel. Later, at the suggestion of Brigham Young, he moved to Ogden Fort, where there was little but sagebrush and nude Indians. Loren Farr was called a stake president, and James Lake, Horace Rawson, and others were on the High Council. William Bailey Lake to the Quorum of 70. They moved to a place later called Harrisville, but because of Indian uprisings, moved to Loren Fort in Ogden in 1851. James Lake marries Joseph Taylor, another widower, as James Lake's husband, Stephen Ordway, was killed while logging for cabin logs for building cabins. On October 8, 1853, at General Conference, James Lake is called from the pulpit to become a patriarch of the Weber stake in Ogden, and was set apart after conference by President Heber C. Kimball. James also enters plural marriage, marries Esther Ann Pierce Keene for time only. In 1855, Grasshopper's drought hit hard. George Lake and Joseph Taylor helped build a canal. Later, Joseph Taylor became the water master of the irrigation company. Pleasant Green Taylor and William Bailey Lake, called as missionaries, go to the Salmon River Mission at Fort Lamhi. On 27 July 1857, the U.S. Army is marched to Utah to put down the invented rebellion. 2,500 men were sent, and later 3,018 were sent in 1858. On 18 March 1858, evacuation from the Salt Lake in northern Utah, where many of the saints moved to Spanish Fork. James Lake's wives, Pamela, Esther Jean, and widow Mary McMurray, and family go for safety. The U.S. Army is set up in Camp Floyd, Cedar Valley, by order of General Albert Sidney Johnston. The saints move back more north to harvest their crops and continue living and watching the army closely. On 26 June 1860, George Albert Smith of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles goes to Ogden to visit James and Pamela Lake. 7 August 1867, James Lake and families, by invitation of Brigham Young, went to Salt Lake to receive their full anointings, arriving on 9 August 1867. James Lake Jr. had married 6 women. Mary Lake, sealed in the Logan Temple; Elizabeth Stover, sealed in the Logan Temple; Pamela Smith, sealed in the Endowment House, 8 October 1853 by Heber C. Kimball, and again in the same place, 11 October 1861 by Brigham Young. Esther Ann Pierce Keene, 8 October 1853 for time only, as well as Mary Hutton McMurray, 15 October 1857 for time only. And Polly Smith, Pamela Smith's sister, that died in Kirtland, Ohio, was sealed 11 October 1861 by Pamela and her husband, once again acting as proxy. Once again sealed, Pamela was sealed on 19 December 1889 in the Logan Temple. They later removed themselves to from Ogden to Oxford, Idaho, where James Lake and Pamela Smith Lake spent the rest of their lives. She died March 20th, 1873, and he died October 7th, 1874, in his 85th year. Both are buried in Oxford, Idaho. James Lake and his wife, Pamela, were highly esteemed by the authorities of the church. and the love and reverence of their posterity towards them was akin to adoration.